Soleimani's killing marks a major escalation in tensions between Washington and Tehran. The Pentagon claims that Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack Americans in Iraq and the Middle East. Top Iraqi militia commander Abdul Mahdi al-Muhandis, an advisor to Soleimani, was also killed in the attack. Soleimani was a major figure in the Iranian regime, whose force reported directly to the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The high-profile assassinations are likely to be a massive blow to Iran, which has been locked in long conflict with the United States that escalated sharply last week with the storming of the U.S. embassy in Iraq by pro-Iranian militia following a U.S. air raid on the Kataib Hezbollah militia founded by Muhandis. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, protesters celebrated the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Iraqis were seen chanting slogans in Baghdad's Tahrir Square, carrying a giant Iraqi flag through the streets. Speaking on condition of anonymity, U.S. officials said that the U.S. was aware and ready to defend themselves in the event of an Iranian response. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by our correspondent in New York, Nick Harper. Nick, thanks very much indeed for joining us. It's been quite a week. I guess it's been building up for a while now, and that this strike killing this Iranian leader perhaps was something that was on the cards.
PT, I think you're right. I think it's been building for some time, really, since the beginning of the Trump administration. Now, Donald Trump always said when he was campaigning to be president that he was unhappy with that nuclear deal with Iran that was signed by the previous U.S. administration, the Obama administration, back in 2015. That was the agreement whereby Iran said that it would halt its nuclear activities in return for sanctions freezes and help with their economy. Now, Donald Trump always said that he wanted to renegotiate that. He simply pulled out of that deal almost 2 years ago. And at that point, we've seen relations with Iran significantly deteriorate. But as you mentioned, within the course of this last week, they have spiraled even further. At the beginning of this week, with the storming of the U.S. embassy in Baghdad by those Iranian militia protesters, we saw things heading in a very significant direction, and now we have the assassination of this top military commander by the US on foreign soil in Iraq. It has the potential to destabilize things even further within the region, but of course also drawing Iraq into a very difficult position, the potential of being in the middle of this proxy war between the two countries. The fact that it happened on Iraqi soil, something that the Iraqi Prime Minister has already said that he is not happy about. The fact that the US carried out airstrikes earlier on in the week, about a week ago, targeting some of those Iran militia in Iraq. He said that went against the sovereignty of Iraq and vowed to take action as well. So the Iranians and the Iraqis particularly displeased at this time with the United States. This assassination has the potential for some very serious and significant repercussions.
But I guess the White House is hailing this as a victory.
Absolutely, and they're pointing to the fact that Soleimani was responsible for the death of hundreds of US personnel within the region during the course of many years. They also say that they carried out this strike effectively in a preemptive way. They said it was a defensive action in response to imminent threats to American lives. Now, they haven't said exactly what those threats are. They haven't said if there was some plot or plan in place directly targeting US personnel, whether it was troops or civilian personnel within Iraq or within the wider region. But they are saying that this was something that they needed to do to protect American lives. So yes, they're very much hailing this as a victory. Remember that they also designated Soleimani and his Quds Force as a terrorist group. It is someone who they have wanted to get for some time but have decided not to. Moving forward now takes things in a very different direction.
So moving forward, as you say, what could happen? I mean, we've got the Iranians swearing that they will revenge, and the Americans say that they will defend themselves and do what's necessary. What could this mean?
Well, the fact that there is this suggestion by the Iranians that they want to carry out severe revenge against the criminals suggests that any US personnel within Iraq, within the wider region, are potential targets. The Iraqis are also caught up in the middle, but the US at this stage are saying to American citizens, non-essential citizens, that they should withdraw from Iraq. They have that fear that there is some potential retaliatory attack. And then, of course, it's a question of what the Iranians want to do. Rhetoric is all very well, but whether they go ahead with action, that's where things could get very significant and very severe, whether they decide to do that on a national government level. But there's also the potential for more protests on the streets. The supporter of those Iranian militia, the supporters of Soleimani himself, they could be out in force. And we could see similar scenes as we saw earlier this week outside the US Embassy, where they managed to breach the outer perimeter of the embassy and set parts of it on fire.
What's been the political reaction inside America? And I'm thinking the Republicans will support their leader, but have the Democrats had anything to say with this? Because some people might feel that this perhaps might have been just a step too far.
Well, absolutely, yes. And bear in mind that we are in very much the throes of a presidential election. It doesn't take place until November, later on this year. But we have about 14, 15 Democrat candidates still in the running. They're beginning to put out statement this morning. One of the most forceful came out last night from the former vice president and the current frontrunner in the Democrat pack, Joe Biden. Now, he said that it wasn't a bad thing taking out Soleimani, but he did say that doing so, and doing so in the way that the United States did, had tossed a stick of dynamite into a tinderbox, and he warned that this had potentially massive implications for the region.
All right, so what do we know about this Qasem Soleimani and Abdul Mahdi al-Muhandis? How significant is this hit, and does it change the game, or do others just come up perhaps and take their place?
Well, very significant. Soleimani himself, a 62-year-old top general, the thinking is that he was really second in command under the supreme leader in Iran. He headed up that elite force, the Quds Force, and was very well respected, but also very well feared within Iran. He had been responsible for carrying out a number of targeted killings within the country, but also within the wider region. As I mentioned before, the United States credited him with hundreds of deaths of US personnel, injuring hundreds more as well. He was very much seen as a significant, influential figure, along the lines of one of the top generals here in the United States, potentially the similar type of ranking as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. An assassination attempt on anyone of that magnitude is always going to be significant. The very fact that the US were able to carry out this strike unilaterally and to carry out this assassination on foreign soil will be seen as a very significant move. But he was a top player with Iran. Whether or not someone else comes up to replace him, I mean, of course that is likely, but we probably will not see someone of this magnitude that was respected and feared to the extent that Soleimani was within Iran, coming up and filling that position as quickly as is possible.
Some say that the whole Middle East region is a bit of a chess game, and people trying to these powers trying to vie for control. And I just wonder what the response has been from some of the US allies in the region might have been.
Well, at this stage, they seem to be holding back, but you're right about this being a chess game, because there is a certain irony in the fact that just until recently, the US and Soleimani, at least under the Kurd elite force, were working together to a certain extent. They were both working together to help push out ISIS from the region. So he was in contact, at least to a certain extent, with the United States until recently, the fact that they were working together on this. But now the United States, now that it's been done, has, of course, turned their backs on him and carried out this assassination attempt. The wider region, of course, will want to try and diffuse the tensions. So we're likely to see US allies like Saudi Arabia wanting to call for calm. It's whether or not there's any power broker, someone who can step in to try and sort out the mess between the United States or Iran. Perhaps someone like Oman that might want to step in and try and carry out some sort of peaceful negotiations to de-escalate the situation that has huge potential for escalating very, very quickly.
All right, Nick, thanks very much indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. That's our US correspondent in New York, Nick Harper, talking to us about this situation that's taking place in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and involving the United States, where a senior Iranian leader has been killed by a US drone strike on Friday, in the early hours of Friday. Okay, for more analysis, we're also joined via Skype by Professor John Stremlau, who's an international relations professor at Wits University here in Johannesburg. Prof, thanks very much for joining us, and welcome to the program. A heavy strike, and some people perhaps trying to figure out whether it was justified or ill thought.
It's a move by Donald Trump, and the discussion that you just had with Nick Harper talked about powers and interstate relations in a rather conventional way. Donald Trump is a very unconventional president. George W. problems. I had great reservations about the invasion of Iraq, which actually served Iran's purposes by removing Saddam Hussein. But George W. Bush was given the option of taking out Soleimani, and he decided against it because it would be too much of an escalation and unpredictable. Barack Obama was presented by this option, according to reports I've seen, and he also rejected it. Donald Trump is down in Mar-a-Lago for a holiday weekend and gets his Secretary of Defense, Mike Esper, to give him options, and he decides to take out Soleimani. I don't have any confidence that he has any or plan and contingencies on this, and the Iranians have proven to be extremely clever in their asymmetric war with the United States. They were behind the attack on the oil installations in Saudi Arabia a few months back, as you may remember. Soleimani was a very clever man, and he's now gone. He was clearly an enemy, but the predictability now is such that I hope that the powers that Nick referred to will try to calm things a bit, and that China and Russia will urge restraint. We are in an election year in the United States. Trump is under impeachment. So therefore, I expect the Iranians will do something, but I hope it's not too extreme.
All right, let's talk a little bit about this region in general. You know, we've got Iraq right in the middle of all of this, Iran, we've got Turkey, Syria, and Jordan, all of these players around this area, and US have always wanted to get as much influence and control in the region. Who is at war with who? Or, I mean, who are the protagonists, would you say, all trying to get their influence in this region?
Peter, you raise a very important question with history. Control of the Middle East oil supplies was a big deal for the United States for decades, and its freedom of access to the transit routes, which is still important. But this is now self-sufficient in oil and energy, in fact, as an exporter. Donald Trump, to his credit, to power and said that should end these endless wars. A struggle between the Shiite Islamic forces and the Sunni Islamic forces, symbolized by Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other, the Shia power. And then you do have Israel. The only one to praise internationally that I'm aware of is Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Thinks it's just fine that he would take out Soleimani for Israel's interest. Much more of a local and national, religious national conflict in the region. The U.S. is in this, but as we have seen, what the Iranians have done is and under Soleimani, is to have these relationships with paramilitary forces, insurgents in like Hezbollah, and they tried to replicate that from Lebanon and their success there throughout the region as part of their effort to dominate the region. I can't see where the United States is a serious player these days, particularly with the unpredictability of Donald Trump.
All right, so Iran, for the longest time, I can remember, nuclear capability, nuclear arsenal, nuclear threat has always been a concern. Surely this kind of aggression is not going to help in dealing with that issue.
Of course, Peter, you're absolutely right, and it's a good reminder. That nuclear deal that Nick referred to back in 2015, that Barack Obama took the lead in putting together the multi-party agreement, the Iranians were willing to play. They were willing to do diplomatic, engagement and enter into an agreement that had promise, and that the European Chinese thought had promise. All the major powers are not nuclear proliferators or want to see nuclear proliferation, and Iran was using this bargaining chip for their much more important interests. They've got domestic problems, and they've got obviously regional priorities. So that diplomatic initiative was very promising. Trump came in and ripped it up. I suspect he did it more because he didn't like Obama and he wanted to show he was different than Obama. It was not imagination, a strategic decision by him. Strategically, he doesn't think about foreign policy as conventional interstate relations suggest in my textbooks. And so he tore that agreement up. And then what? He ends up dealing on in a much more asymmetrical conflict that we now see unfolding. And I think it's really, and his military is perplexed by him, the decider. And he decided on this, and they decided that, okay, they would implement it. And there are certainly on the right and the conservatives, those who are celebrating this removal of Soleimani. He's a bad guy, but it comes with very difficult to predict reactions from Iran.
All right, so those difficult to predict reactions, I just wonder what could play out in the coming days. Might we see some terrorist attacks on U.S. soil in the name of Iran? The spiritual leader says revenge must be sought. What could play out in the near future?
Well, we don't know, obviously, but I suspect that it will be within the region. It may be the region, which they've already been doing in Iraq and elsewhere, and as I referred earlier, the oil installations in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that the Chinese and the Russians will be urging Iran to take aggressive action. They'll want restraint. This is a very unpredictable year, and you don't want to give Trump the rallying cry to get reelected, frankly. I don't think these major powers find dealing with him very reassuring in any way. They don't have even an adversary that they can understand and predict. So I think they'll be urging on restraint, and I think there will be some sort of response, maybe against U.S. shipping or against one of the U.S. allies, or certainly in Iraq. But I don't think they'll go after the homeland of the United States, but I could be wrong.
All right, Professor John Stromlo, we're going to have to leave it there, but let's certainly see and watch what unfolds, and we'll keep our viewers up to date with that story.